Hello everybody, I'm Elizabeth Whittome and I'm the author of the A-level and AS-level literature book which Cambridge University Press published last year, and I'm going to talk this morning about the short story. Just a few pointers. Obviously we haven't got a huge amount of time to talk about it, but some of the essential points I think which will help you. The short story is one of my absolutely favourite literary forms. I love reading, of course, and I love reading novels, but one doesn't have time to just sit and read novels from start to finish. They go over several days or even several weeks if they're a really long novel. But the short story can be read in one go, and it's very, very satisfying. Don't think for a moment that it's just a shorter kind of novel. It's not. It's a beautifully structured form if it's well done, and very worthy of study. There are many different kinds of short story, and obviously I'm only going to discuss a few aspects of them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginnings and a bit more about the endings of short stories. What is a short story to begin with? Well, it can be anything from something of just one page, something like 250 words, or it can be several pages, even several thousand words. If you get longer than that, it starts to be called a short novel, or a novella is the word that is often used for that. But the fact that the story is short, sometimes even very short, I'll give you an example of that a bit later, doesn't mean that it's not effective. There are lots of ways it can be effective. It can be not a limitation, but actually a focusing of what the writer is hoping to do. The beginning of a short story can be a bit like a play, where characters and situations are introduced so that you know where you are. Using a narrative point of view, it may be a third person or a first person point of view. I'll just give you an example of that. I made these up, these aren't from a real short story, but this is the sort of thing that could happen. For example, a story could start, Mr. Brown had worked at the company for 40 years, but this was his last day. Makes it absolutely clear Mr. Brown's going to be a major person in the story. He's retiring. So what's going to happen on this retirement day? Is he going to be given a present? Is there going to be some sort of surprising thing happening? Is he going to be asked to come back and work a few days in the week? That's what happens these days to people. We don't know, but we do have that clearly given to us right at the beginning. Or here's another. This is in the first person. I had agreed to marry Jack only a few weeks ago, and today was the day. I wondered if we should have waited longer. And here you've got somebody who is about to get married and is having second thoughts. What an interesting way to start a story. Somebody who's obviously, they've had a whirlwind romance. They agreed to marry only a few weeks ago, and yet here comes the wedding day and we wonder what's going to happen. Of course, it may not be a horrible, tragic story at all. It may be the kind of story, after all, everybody has second thoughts on their wedding day. They think, am I really doing the right thing? And of course you are, most of the time, doing the right thing. But we don't know how that story will turn out. You can see how that's very clear for the reader, very straightforward. The reader knows where she is or he is. We even have a main character presented right from the beginning. But that doesn't necessarily happen in a short story, especially these days. More contemporary short stories, more modern short stories even, often start in media res, which is a Latin phrase which is rather useful, meaning in the middle of things. And that could be a conversation. And you don't know who's speaking. You could have some little bits of conversation. If you think of that last example, perhaps the girl who's about to marry is talking to her mother. And the first words of the story are, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, she said. Of course you are, darling. Don't worry about it. Everybody feels like that on their wedding day, her mother said. And we've come at it in a slightly different way. We've come at it in a more oblique way. And our attention is engaged and we want to carry on reading. We think, oh, what's going on here? Somebody has agreed to get married, but they're having second thoughts. So there are ways of approaching things which are different. So always useful to look at the beginning of a story. With regard to endings, the short story is often described as being the literary form which has a surprise ending, a twist in the tale people often talk about. This is not necessarily true. Of course there can be a twist in the tale. It can be the kind of story which has a sudden surprising event at the end which changes everything, sometimes in the very last line of the story. It can be very dramatic or very neat to just finish the story in that way. It has a twist or a sudden surprise at the end. And I'll give you an example of that, which always interests me because it was written over half a century ago, this story, and it's about computers, and you think, oh, it must be old-fashioned. But I don't think it is. It's a very short story by a man called Frederick Brown, a science fiction story about computers, written in the 50s, and it's called The Answer. And the story sets up the impression of all of the computer experts across the universe have got together and they are joining up all their computers into one system which they're going to be able to ask questions of. And they link them all up. The moment arrives, the master of the universe comes along ready to flick the switch to make these computers all hum into life. Lovely description of this all happening. And he does this. Everything's humming across the universe, these computers all linked up. And the question which everybody wants to ask is asked. And the question is there a God? And at that moment, thunderbolts come out of the sky and fuse the system on. And a great voice says, there is now. Now, I love that story because it's such a simple story, really, you know, and it, in a way it's a bit like a joke. It's so short and it's just got its punchline. But when you think of how computers have advanced since that time, it's still relevant and it's still the question everybody wants to know. Is there a God? And you have to reflect on the fact that, well, computing has come so far. It's horrendous if you think of artificial intelligence and how much it's advanced. That's quite an upsetting story. I like that. I think it's a good example of a story with a twist in the tale, which is helpful to the reader, because you start the story, you think this is only a page long, and boom, there it is, and it's done at the end. However, probably a more reflective short story written these days doesn't have a plot necessarily, but creates a mood, creates a character and an atmosphere, and may use a symbol which starts and ends the story. If I give you an example from the great short story writer of the early 20th century, Katherine Mansfield, Miss Brill, this elderly lady who wears a fox fur, who has a very set way of doing things, who goes for a walk, and essentially the story is about the conflict between youth and age, really. She, not from her point of view, because she looks around and enjoys seeing all the young people, but she sits on a bench and some young people are rather rude about her and rude about her fox fur. And when she goes home, she doesn't even buy her usual little cake that she always enjoys in the evening when she's gone for a walk. And she's just very unhappy. And it's a sad story, a sad reflection on the cruelty which people can express towards each other, not realising they're being cruel even sometimes, although I think probably the young man and the young girl who are wrapped up in each other probably were just dismissive, just an old lady, she's nobody really. But you see it, of course, from Miss Brill's point of view, and the fox fur is a sort of symbol of her dignity and her age as well. And it is mentioned through the story as a symbol which gives life to the story. So not a surprise ending, really, but much more an evocation of character, of mood, and of a theme which, in fact, you're going to reflect on much longer than you're going to reflect on The Answer by Frederick Brown, which is an amusing story and gives you a bit of thought about computing. But this one really makes you think about human nature. And there are many well-known short story writers who, in fact, would create that sort of atmosphere. It won't necessarily have a twist in the tale. I mean, those writers of that we all know of the 19th century, whose stories write with a surprise ending, are people like Guy de Maupassant, who I actually studied. I did French A-level actually, and I had to read them in French. Wonderful stories, but they've all been translated into English. They've nearly all got a surprise ending. O. Henry, the American, writing at much the same time, also the same. You might have heard of Edgar Allan Poe, his stories of mystery and imagination, which are Gothic horror stories. They've all got a surprise ending as well. And those are writers whose stories are very satisfying, but they are not, they may create mood, but that's not the essential purpose of the story. I must say something about Alice Munro, who is a great short story writer of the 20th century, who in 2013 was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for her short stories. So there you are, you see, it's a very important form. And she writes such wonderful short stories that when you finish one, you feel as if you've had the depth and complexity of a novel. She creates characters amazingly well. She allows the characters to reflect on their past. She moves between the past and the present in such a way that you feel there's a real world there that she has created, and she is very, very effective. So I do recommend her greatly. And finally, there are some writers who write excellent short stories, but present them in a book of short stories. And when you start reading them, you realise that although each one is a completely separate and perfect little work of art on its own, they actually make up a whole, almost like a novel. Well, it is a novel, really. A really good example of that is the Australian writer Tim Winton. His work, The Turning, is very worth reading. The Turning is itself the name of one of the stories, but those stories cover a lot of years actually, because in one story, the main character of the story is an adolescent boy who's just finished school. In another story, he's a middle-aged man, and and other stories, you've got somebody who's completely unimportant, just on the edge of the story, becomes the main character in another story. And the effect of this is extremely enriching. Because you don't seem to have any peripheral characters, because somewhere along the line they're going to step forward and become the main character in one of the short stories, and the whole effect is terrific. Similarly, the American writer William Faulkner, his stories Go Down Moses, set in the Deep South. I recommend them highly as well. And in the same way, those stories take the same characters but deal with them in different ways and make some peripheral characters into main characters and some main characters into less important ones. But you end up with, it's almost better than a novel, really, because you've got all the novel's depth of exploration of themes and characters, but all from different points of view, and each chapter or each little story is perfect in itself. So happy reading.